same sort of levels as Italy and Greece.
And higher than the US.
Yeah, so certainly any inkling that there could be any sort of change in a stance on the RSPT at this time, I suppose there could be any movement. It's certainly going to impact those commodity markets quite rapidly and quite quickly.
Like it or not, this is a cornerstone policy, though, under Wayne Swan and by default Julia Gillard, of lowering the deficit. This was brought in to address that. You take it away. Where's your credibility on deficit smashing?
Certainly, and the Bulls were adamant that the RSPT would not get through in its current form, and they were also certain that it would be the downfall of Kevin Rudd. Now they've got one of those two things right so far, and one of them potentially a lot quicker than they first thought. You know, Swan's got a bit of a job going into the G20, I think, to defend that RSPT in light of that global economic environment, in light of the fact that, as you mentioned, it was the Australian resource sector that buffered the Australian economy and will continue to need to buffer the Australian economy if it's going to continue to grow through into this recovery.
In fairness, though, Wayne Swan is not the only one of the G20 leaders, and we'll call him the leader because he's acting in his capacity now as Deputy Prime Minister, picking a fight with big corporations. You look at Barack Obama v BP. You look at a lot of the banks that are under fire in the UK with the new leadership. You know, the banking levy that's now probably going to be replicated in France and Germany and was triggered in the UK. So he's got allies when it comes to bashing the big boys.
Yeah, certainly does. And it's it's kind of hard to be held to ransom by those sectors and by those big boys.
But the difference is that there's not the same degree of animosity inside Australia towards the mining sector as there would be and as there is against those energy giants, against those banks offshore. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, that's true. That's true to form. Look, I think again, especially we're going to hear it played out in the G20 when they're going to be talking about how they're going to be reducing those deficits, those austerity measures. This is obviously our linchpin of an austerity measure here for Australia, if you like.
Well, how do you read it playing out, and then what are you telling clients? Because do you think they will take this route of, well, we'll negotiate, and that's almost their out clause to get them through an election, and then they might ramp things up yet again once that election's in the bag? How do you play it in this environment?
It's very interesting. Well, the market is selling the rumour and buying the fact, which is generally the wrong way round. We saw that played out just a couple of weeks ago with the loosening of the yuan. The market bought that rumour straight out the blocks, it seemed with the minings they bought the rumour straight out the blocks. As soon as it was digested and the US got hold of it, it kind of failed to excite, as we've seen over the last couple of days.
I heard on the street column of the Wall Street Journal overnight saying, look, the only way this tax is going to be killed for sure is if the next election leads to Labour and not just Rudd leaving office. Do you agree with that?
Abbott's already mentioned that as well, that it will be rescinded if a coalition should reach government later in the year also.
Have you shifted your stance now politically on who's likely to come into the lodge next year?
We can't share those things, but right. in a market sense, I think should we see a bit of a weakening of that stance, we'll see an impact straight away on commodities. We could see some confidence again in supply constraints from our miners. Our already brilliantly magnificent terms of trade are going to get a boost, and you'll see it first certainly in a support or a rally in the Aussie dollar.
It's going to see inflation rearing its head again, winners and losers and all that. Maybe the Reserve has to act. Simon, back with you shortly. Simon Mariner from Aliom. I want to remind you that at 8:30 Eastern, ComSec, are we going to take a break or are we going to carry on? We'll carry on with my special guest this hour, Simon Mariner from Aliom. This is where the debate is now heading, because Samantha was fairly upbeat there about, okay, they'll talk about RSPT, they'll probably talk long enough to get them through an election, and then they'll do whatever they do. But we came back in and we're talking about, you've got to fight the deficit. Now, do you then ditch it and do you look at GST as would be perhaps from a Labour standpoint more of an equitable policy where everyone has to pay their dues? That debate's going out and playing out in the UK. They've had to fight their deficit. They came out with a budget and they did raise VAT, which is like our GST. It's a consumption tax up to 20%. What does that do to inflation?
Well, it's very interesting. I think that the Bank of England has failed for some time now to deliver on their inflation target. Inflation proving to be a lot more resilient in the aftermath of the GFC there. I think, for a while there was plenty of spare capacity, some latent capacity there to absorb that price pressure, to absorb the heat from the economy, but it's just not there. It's not happening now. And understandably, we're getting comments from members of their committee, very interesting, echoing or following the RBA suit, hearing comments even to the word that we need to start to gradually withdraw some of that exceptional stimulus that was in the economy.
They're not keeping it within their band of 2% upper limit, but they will say market forces will bring it back. Are you saying that the world has changed, that argument could have been trotted out perhaps 3 years ago and would have worked? But what factors make it different now? It
is different, and in fact, echoing and following from your first question, Mervyn King's going to be very happy that the government is fiscally accommodating his monetary policy. Are they fiscally accommodating it with the right tool, VAT, as opposed to maybe some other indirect or direct tax? I'm not sure, but in terms of the effects and the economic effects, look, there may be banking or relying on the fact that they're anticipating increased unemployment levels there. That could hopefully help in subduing some of those tax increases and then not being as inflationary, because they don't fall into sort of wage demands and wage pressures and inflation expectations there. But they're straying rather close to that nasty S word, stagflation, where you've got the zero or nil growth and relatively high levels of inflation there.
So what sector has to really lead that economy first out of that stagflation environment?
Yeah, look, and it's a hard one, especially for the UK, that's so heavily imbued and embedded in the financial sector. They don't make a lot of stuff and export a lot of stuff. So and there's been the limelight on it, and essentially, we're looking at G20 comments ahead of the G20 as the UK involved with France and Germany imposing more provisions on banks' balance sheets in the financial sector as well going forward.
Yeah, the US really trying to steer a very clear course away from that, and as well as that, what about trade? There's not a word of it from Obama's side of the fence, although we know every communique gives it some lip service at the very least. So interesting to see what plays out. Simon, back with you shortly. Simon Mariner, special hour-long guest from Aliom. Coming up for you though, the NAV.